Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. For those who are here physically and the others who are following us online, I'd like to welcome you to the very last, but by no means least, of our sessions in the Election Dialogue series that the WSG has been running for the last 4 weeks or so. And this session is devoted to a consideration of the likely implications of the elections in South Africa for the global community, incorporating global Africa, the global South, but also the rest of the international community. When South Africa gained freedom in 1994, it was considered as a major victory for humanity. And all across the world, there were celebrations of what was described as the South African miracle. 30 years on, regardless of the ups and downs that we may have experienced in the journey of democratic governance and development, it is equally remarkable that it is South Africa in the Committee of Nations that approached the International Court of Justice on the question of Gaza. Perhaps pure coincidence, but nevertheless one that also points to the fact that as an African actor and as a player in the international system, what happens in South Africa not only carries implications for the citizens of the country, but also for the African continent and for the rest of the world. And this is what this panel will be walking us through today, under the guidance of a good friend and colleague, Professor Chris Landsberg, who is a Sachi Chair at the University of Johannesburg. Chris has been many things in his life, leading think tanks, heading departments, and at present leading a major research project as a Sachi professor, Sachi Chair at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you very much, Chris, for accepting to moderate this session. Chris will be supported in the dialogue, in the conversation, by 3 other colleagues. I will start from his immediate left, and I suspect it is ideological. With my colleague with whom I worked at International IDEA and also in the broader electoral field, Olufunto Akinduro, Senior Program Officer, International IDEA, Africa and West Asia Office, previously also of the Electoral, what started as the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa and became the Electoral Institute for Democracy in Africa, AISA, with which we are familiar. Thank you, Olufunto. Sister Lebohang, Peko, thank you so much, Lebohang, for being here, in spite of some fairly tough circumstances for your family. Really, really grateful that you made time to join us. Lebohang, for anybody who has worked on issues of economic governance on the continent, is very well known for the work which she has done and continues to do around trade and development, feminist economics, and other such domains that speak to the empowerment of citizens on the African continent. Lebohang, welcome to the panel. And finally, we thought we couldn't close this session without having one of our own from the School of Governance on the panel. And our international relations guru is Dr. Ekemini Ita Okon, who is here with us at the School of Governance, working on the broad field of international relations, currently focused on just transitions and climate change issues, among others. Ekemini, you're at home, but welcome anyway to the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's applaud them, and I hand over to the chair of the panel. You can choose to sit them or...
So apparently I should switch on my mic. But I think they're recording it. I just take instructions. Should I turn that one off? I'm IT illiterate and very proud of it. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to all of you joining us in person, and to all of you in the clouds joining us online. Welcome, and I'm certainly looking forward to an interactive session on a very important and novel topic. Greetings from the place down the street, down the road. You know, the one there in the leafy suburbs of Auckland Park. I bring you warm greetings, both Lebohang and I. I see she did not state the UJ action. But I think it's a very important topic, and I would like to thank Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, long-time associate, colleague, partner in crime, and certainly one of the most respected scholars of our generation. Bayu and I met in all places, of all places we met at Witsbad at the South African Institute of International Relations about a quarter of a century ago. I remember that so vividly. I'm going to say something more about Professor Olukoshi. We are here to debate an important topic, a novel, even a challenging topic. It's not always that people focus on the implications of a country's electoral outcomes for its near abroad, Southern Africa in our case, the broader continent, the South, already the global South, and just to finish South Africa, the concentric circles of South Africa's foreign policy, relations with the North. I suspect that's going to come up a lot today. And then another element of South Africa's international strategy over the last 30 years, it's gone through ebbs and flows, has been transformation of the global financial and political architecture and key institutions there, and bilateral relations. I wish to remind you that literally as we speak, South Africa is presenting yet another case to the ICJ with the full team of members who presented the case in December. This time against the already launched invasion of Rafah. Literally as we speak, it's playing out. Let me start with just four brief scene setters, one or two liners, and then I will pose some questions for our audience. But let me just try and set the context. First of all, I personally would like to introduce the idea, the notion, the aphorism that all politics is local. So the way you perform at home and how strong you are performing at home, and in this case, the manner in which South Africa will execute its high stakes elections during its 30 years, or after its 30 years of post-settlement democracy. So I'd like to introduce that idea. Secondly, I'm just mentioning it for what it's worth. I was part of a panel last week on South Africa's foreign policy at 30. And Professor Adam Habib was part of the panel, together with Leslie Masters and James Mayle from the UK. It was a Chatham House, well-attended event. And I started by asking them a question. And I reminded Professor Habib that 25 years ago or so, Omano Edigeji, my colleague at Center for Policy Studies at the time, was there. But Adam and Bib and I, sponsored by the Southern Africa variant of the Soros Foundation, had a debate around the question whether South Africa is a hegemon or a pivotal state. So I was a bit naughty and asked Adam the question, 30 years later, do you hold the view that South Africa is a hegemon? Because I punted the idea that South Africa was not a hegemon in Africa. It was indeed, it was rather a pivotal state. You're aware of the work, Prof. Olakoshi, of our friend Adekeya Baju and myself on this debate around South Africa and Nigeria's hegemons. What is the difference? A hegemon is a country with undisputed power in relation certainly to its neighbors, its continent, maybe even the global context in the case of the US. Years ago, who can literally lay down the rules to others, impose them, enforce them, and has the means to pay for them, and if need be, use military might to enforce its hegemony. That's a hegemon. A pivotal state, on the other hand, is clearly an important state in relation to neighbors, certainly, and a continent in our case, and has attributes in relation to its neighbors that if it progresses politically, socially, economically, and otherwise, it will pull the others with it in the positive direction. Conversely, the weaker it becomes, the more it has a negative demonstration effect on the region. And it's in that context that I would like to place the idea of the election. Let me finally invoke something Professor Bayo Olakoshi did. Bayo, you must remind me about the date because I want to write something about that. Professor Bayo Olakoshi, I attended a SAPES conference with Bayo. Bayo must be more than 20 years ago, probably 20 years ago, 18 years ago or so, in Harare. And Professor Olakoshi gave the keynote address. And of all topics he could have chosen for the keynote address, he spoke about the idea of neglect. When the culture of neglect sets in a country, it is very difficult to overcome it and reverse the trend. And he was bold enough to use his own native country, Nigeria, as a case study, the politics of neglect. When it sets in, I suppose in South Africa, we will talk about service delivery, representativity, and the like. So enough about that. What I plan to do, and then I'm going to start posing some questions and get our panelists to respond. You will, of course, notice that my role is just to be the bouncer today. The balance of power has finally been restored, where we have a powerful female panel, and I've been reduced to the role of bodyguard. Let's continue. I want us to have an inside-outside approach. In other words, start from the inside by building scenarios around how you think the election is likely to play out, and play around with different scenarios. The idea of coalitions is very much in vogue. Some people believe that the ANC might surprise other parties. And just for what it's worth, it's actually coming out in this week's Sunday Times. Ibrahim Fakir and I just penned a piece together on the idea of a government of national unity that should be explored, or at least a grand coalition. And just on that point, don't believe either the ANC or the DA when they say they're not talking to each other about the prospect of a coalition. They are in talks. In fact, there are letters flying around. You know, South Africa's got a leaking problem. That's why we have a water situation. Then I want us to return to an outside-in approach or perspective. How are different forces in a deeply divided geopolitical context, a combustible one, a volatile one, and different forces likely to respond? And just to mention three for you. The West, the US in particular, who I can share with you, my research tells me that the DA did in fact engage the US government on a regime change scenario. But based on their own calculations that even if the ANC dips under 50%, it is likely to remain the dominant party. So they can't go for an overt, blunt regime change in South Africa. And what is likely to happen, irrespective of what the outcome is, it's already happening. Institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy, Congress, is really likely to take us back, Lebohang, to the immediate post-94 period when donors just awashed us with resources for NGOs and stuff. And they're going to make civil society the guards of this new administration. That's on the agenda. The constitutional courts, watchdog agencies. So there's a new oppositionalism that might be at play post the election, and some are actually cooperating with political parties. Then we have the reality that we all are aware about, that the DA invited only Western powers or Western countries to come and observe the election. All they should have done is just put the AU and SADC's names there, and it would have looked like a more representative group. But it says a lot about that party. The ANC, on the other hand, invited the AU. It would have been good for them to include and invite Western observers as well. So enough about that. Let's start with the questions. I want to start with the inside-out questions first. So, to our electoral specialists on the panel, Dr. Akinduro, I'm so glad that to have you on the panel. You are familiar with continental elections, elections in general. I suggest to you that in the context of 2024 being a unique and pivotal year for elections globally, when no fewer than 64 countries will go to the polls, including big powers, the United States, a not so big power, the United Kingdom, but who suffers from delusions of grandeur and things that it punches above its weight. But within the G7 context, for example, there will be elections, irrespective of the outcome of the election in those countries. They will react to South Africa's elections. First question to you, Doc. How confident are you that South Africa will uphold its strong tradition of undisputed elections? Are we likely to see, for the first time in 30 years, a contested outcome? And what will that do to South Africa's standing in the continent and in the world? Or do you believe that South Africa will remain an example setter to the rest of the continent? As you try to respond to that, let me come to my two other colleagues. Apart from the G7, who's likely to have their reactions, and I don't think all of them will necessarily respond in the same fashion, depending on your scenarios. What do you think, Dr. Peko, this election will mean for the South? I can tell you that just given what's happening with the role South Africa is playing around the Israel-Gaza conflict, Muslim countries and Arab countries are literally lobbying for the ANC to return, literally. Important constituencies like the Association of Muslim Scholars have come out openly saying we would like for the ANC to be returned, and even suggested that without interfering, that Minister Naledi Pandor should stay as Minister of International Relations. But what if an EFF ANC scenario comes to fruition, or for that matter, an ANC DA? What do you think are the likely reactions from different global forces, and particularly from a global economy point of view? And then Dr. Ayita Okon, I like the fact that you've been introduced as somebody who also focuses on the politics of energy just transitions. It's interesting that in Europe there seems to be reversals of these things. And I remind you that the EU will have parliamentary elections from the 6th to the 9th of next month. And there's a broad consensus that we're likely to see a shift to the right, where some of these parties will challenge this green transition. So African states should have it, but they can do as they please, as we've seen with their reactions to Russia's sanctions. That's a mouthful, but why don't we start there? So, Dr. Akinduro, by the way, I forgot to tell you that Lebogang is a doctor to be. Her dissertation is about to go for examination. She will obtain her doctorate. She's already a doctor. She behaves like one because she is one. She just needs the title. And I can gladly tell you that I know her supervisor. You're looking at him. Over to you, Dr. Akinduro.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm glad you don't know my supervisor because I am not Dr. Akinduro. So, all the best, Lebogang.
Oh, you're not doctor yet?
No. So thank you
Come
for
and talk
letting
to
me
us.
know.
Come and talk to us afterwards.
But yeah, thank you so much for the question. South Africa's 2024 elections and its global relevance, I think it's an important one, considering we're going to have 19 to 20 elections on the African continent, and globally, like you said, almost 1 billion people will be going to the polls this year. But the interesting thing, I think, for the African continent is the question of whether, after all these elections, I mean, do we come to the end of 2024 seeing stronger democracy on the continent? For me, that's a big question. And that brings me to the interest, the continental interest in South Africa's democratic trajectory. I mean, I think South Africa has really, brought up a lot of lessons for the continent. The fact that, one, democracy is not a straight line journey. South Africa has also shown the rest of Africa that you can pause and review at any point in your democratic journey. I've sat in meetings where people will say, who gives anyone the right to question aspects of the Constitution? This has been done continuously in South Africa, 25 years after its transition to democracy. That case went to court, and the Crown Court was able to say you should have a more inclusive interpretation of the PR system, which is quite, symbolic. The whole of Africa is actually, like looking forward to these elections. 2019 was not any less significant with judgments around, for instance, the voter register, for instance. Those were quite pivotal. So South Africa, the point I'm making is South Africa really holds a very strong place in Africa's learning on democratic development. So the outcome of the 2024 elections, cannot be ignored. It's a year that we're going to see a lot of big elections, and it's significant. You're looking South Africa 30 years post-apartheid, and you're looking Rwanda, how many years post-genocide? And what's the story of democracy you want to tell in those two countries? And then also, interestingly, it's a year where we have so many planned transition elections. But what's the certainty that we would find those elections taking place? One very huge trend you would find in Africa is the role of the judiciary in electoral processes. And you asked an interesting question. Is South Africa going to see its first contested election? In most of my writings on democracy in Africa, I always say it's the trend of contested elections. So is South Africa joining that trend? But I think my answer to that will be, it wouldn't be the first contested elections, but maybe the extent. Because even when you look at the pre-election space, just the number of court cases, the number of judgments that speak very loud and clear to key democratic principles that a lot of countries have to learn from. And I don't expect that in the post-election space, it will be any less contested. However, the question, however, is what is the level of trust in public institutions? That's the line. That's where you draw the line between South Africa and a lot of other countries where we view contested elections as a threat. Because for us, contested elections speak to, questions around legitimacy of the incoming government. But you look at South Africa, like I said, it's not the first. I remember, I think 2019, where you even had open protests in the IEC's results center. But did the IEC come out of that still a trusted institution? I think it did. And that's because these are, so whether we talk of the IEC, whether we could talk of the judiciary, and I think these are two key institutions in 2024 that we need to look at. Will they both come out unscratched? If I'm allowed to...
Sure.
Maybe...
No. I actually just want to have two follow-up questions on two of the points you made.
Okay.
So the fact that the IEC is also now engaging in lawfare, right?
Lawfare.
I mean, that there's something that happened to our politics where, man, the courts decide on so many issues that should be resolved politically. There's an obsession with litigation and the politics of, and litigious politics that I'm concerned about. How concerned are you about that, or do you think it's a good trend? And secondly, the fact that the IEC has joined the fray, is there a risk that its credibility could be dented? Also going to court to seek clarity on essentially one individual who started a mini version of the ANC.
Okay, good question. And I think I was going to go a bit towards Senegal to talk about when we think of the role of the judiciary and how, for instance, that played out to a point where, the parliament is now saying, let's audit judgments of the judiciary. And that, came with big questions around trust in the institution of the judiciary. Litigious elections or political decisions, I think it's a two-sided thing. Could be an opportunity for you to say, is there freedom for just anyone to approach the courts and, seek interpretations as we go along? Or do we want to open the space to institutions interpreting and still being dragged upon their own interpretation? And the interesting thing, is the level of openness of that access to justice in South Africa. I've gone to forums where people say, I will not give that civil society group an accreditation to do civic education or to observe because they joined a political party in court in a case. And I asked a question to say, but look at how we came with the case that led to the decision of having independent candidates on the ballot. It involved politicians and civil society. So that could be an opportunity to test the weight of that principle in South Africa. But could it also be a threat, a risk, like you're saying? There have been a lot of questions about, for instance, the decision of the IEC to appeal. It was one thing to go to court, but then appeal. But in my view, it's all questions of what do the courts stand for? And are these really just indications to say, across institutions, individuals, political parties, that is a space that remains trusted and protected in South Africa's democracy? And is that what really sets South Africa apart from the rest of the world, the rest of the continent, I would say.
Sure. Thanks. Some key insights there. I sometimes wonder whether we continue to be a constitutional democracy or a judicial one. Dr. Tubi Lebo, Peko, please zoom in for us on likely, we're dealing with the inside-out perspective first. What changes do you see in South Africa's foreign policy and international posture going forward, and play around with some electoral outcome scenarios as you answer that question from a political economy point of view, which is clearly one of your strengths, if not your, your foremost area of contribution, and you've made some tremendous contributions in terms of political economy, but particularly feminism and political economy. So just use that paradigm of yours, and how do you see the outcome and the impact on South Africa's global and continental posture?
Thank you. So the one thing is to realize that one of the things, the pivots that has happened since South Africa took Israel to the ICJ is also a reassertion of a semblance of moral and political leadership. And I think this should be viewed not only as a reassertion of the South Africa of 1994, but also a reassertion of a different kind of African state, which is not beholden to Western, and you mentioned, Chris, Western sensibilities and the Western imagination, and it actually turns on its head the idea of who is influenced by whom. It potentially flattens our world and moves us away from bipolarism and this idea of the West and the rest, and really brings us to a position where the rest is everybody, and including the US as the rest, the European Union as the rest, the UK, which is indeed a diminishing imperial power that is a legend in its own bathroom mirror, as the rest. And what we are also seeing is that the increase of, for example, the influence of the expansion of the BRICS into a strange hodgepodge of frankly disparate interests, most of whom are united by their deep disdain or their deep resentment towards US imperialism and economic imperialism, and how this then South Africa has then positioned itself not only as a leader in South Africa's own right, but how this could potentially bring about a swing from the south towards the north. I'd also like to suggest that in all of this, there are 2 or 3 different scenarios. The one is an ANC-DA type outcome. This potentially means then that there's going to be a huge amount of wrestling in parliamentary and at executive level around what kind of foreign policy is in line with what has been a traditionally statist, internationalist, Southern-led, and slightly liberatory tradition that the ANC-led government has carried with it, and how this might need to shift if there were to be some kind of a coalition with the DA, which of course has already been mentioned, has strongly Western, and I use the word with caution and with many riders, but we all understand the political dog whistle that represents. But a kind of very Eurocentric, Western-centric standpoint, which situates African people, the land question, as quite periphery, which also situates questions of free trade as very central, free marketism at the expense of a developmental agenda, which also situates bilateralism and multilateralism as fairly peripheral in the interest of a government and a state that is much more beholden to free market and foreign direct investment. Let's read foreign as particularly northern, because I don't think that under a DA government will be per se as interested in building the Africa agenda, building Agenda 2063, for example, building the multiplicity of dormant but still very useful SADC protocols, for example, rebuilding the various RECs across the continent, and of course, situating this within the context of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, still the largest free trade agreement in the world as we speak, with its own complications, but in fact a very important document. As much as I'm critical of it, it's better than having nothing there that anchors us as a people. So I think that we need to pivot away from this idea that it's only we who are going to be influenced by the rest of the world. In fact, we are influencing the world. And I think that there's this also, that I'd also like us to levitate around the idea of collected woundedness. So when we, for example, as you say, Chris, when we hear countries that seem disparate, far away from us, so countries of the Arab states, many Middle Eastern countries who are vested in the domestic elections of South Africa, millions or thousands of miles away, because they understand that there's a political resonance and a political convenience with having an ANC-led government. Whatever many critiques may be of the ANC, it has on certain occasions, like the ICJ, been of great use of upending the kind of hegemonic, Western hegemonic sort of power play that we see in these spaces. The other scenario might be the potential of an ANC-EFF. Now, I think under ANC-EFF, which I find fairly quite scintillating in a naughty kind of way, because it potentially moves us slightly further left, because I think one of the things that the ANC has been accused of over the last 30 years is of talking left and walking right. What the EFF could potentially do is to place its feet over the fire. Now, there are two scenarios. The EFF, being the smaller party, could also become co-opted and go, into the foibles of the contradictions and the concessions that come with being institutionalized. It's easy to talk nationalization, to talk privatization, nationalization of the Reserve Bank from the backbenchers, from that side of the benches. It is an entirely different thing to try to convince global economic governance structures like your World Banks, like your IMF, and to also keep your OECDs and so forth happy, right? And this has been the greatest critique of the ANC, even though I think much more, to use the coin of phrase, much more could have been done, but that has been one of the great contradictions and tensions. So in this regard, the second potential is that the EFF moves an ANC coalition further to the left, and that we start having real debates about restitutive land policy, that we start having real debates about redistributive income plans, that we start having real debates around what SOEs, if they were state-led, for example, using a China-style model or a Zambia circa 1965, what would this potentially look like? If we look at the post-liberation government's pre-structural adjustment, of the 1960s, the 1970s. I grew up in exile, and I'll always tell the story of how Zambia looked before structural adjustment and after structural adjustment. It's a chasm of difference, right? So could it be possible for an EFF to use and to leverage, which they've been very good at doing in some municipalities to some extent, to then begin to use their allowed minoritarianism to then shift and to then begin to think around how we even close off certain trading policies, to build in a level of perhaps state protectionism. What does this look like for an AGOA, for example? What does this look like for much more assertive bilateral agreements with other African countries and our space within the African Union? The last one that I'd like to tease out, it's the least likely. What about the scenario where the ANC is completely absent? Let's not negate it, not very likely. But what about the scenario of an EFF, a DA, and an ATC, ABC, and all the other, EFGs, XYs, all the other, constellations of parties that have mushroomed mushroomed exponentially over the last 12 months. And I think at the time of going to press, how many, who's got the numbers? There are like over 100 political parties which are in good standing and registered, let alone the 600, the kiss parties, the football parties, the marijuana parties, all of the others. But the ones that are actually, registered and in good standing, available for us to give them a mandate. What could that potentially look like if these balance of forces came together? And that's not entirely beyond the realm of possibility. If we look at, for example, Kenya a few years ago and the coalition that came out of what used to be called KANU. So this whole idea of coalitionism, although it might be uncomfortable to South Africa, we started as a coalition government, as a government of national unity. Of course, the benevolence of having a 2/3 majority for the ANC did mean that it was tokenistic. But what might that look like where there is so much more at stake and where your power to decide and not decide on land restitution and other things is in the balance? But what does that also eventually look like for other countries as they observe all of these vicissitudes? As Dr. Akinduro has already said, we also have we are also, in many respects, some people say sub-imperial, which I completely disagree with, hegemonic. I lean towards pivotal, or I've used anchor state in my writing, because I think we do hold a particular level of power, but we're like the friendly neighbors who you can borrow sugar from, but please bring it back eventually. Yeah? We will not bomb you, but bring back the sugar eventually. Yeah, at some point. And I think that, in fact, I would like to suggest that. What does this mean then for the countries to whom we borrow, lend sugar as well? How will this swing their own foreign policies? Because we understand that, in fact, the Southern African Customs Union is de facto South Africa plus others. SADC, to some extent, sometimes feels like South Africa plus others, headquartered in Botswana, as it happens. So and then if the BRICS, the SADC, and our influence in the Gs, the G7, the G20, the G77, and so forth, what does that also look like? And finally, the important role that we've also played in global governance recently, and I think we should give ourselves a pat on the back in regard to two things. Firstly was of course the antiretroviral drugs. Yeah. The second was recently the vaccines as well. This important global leadership that we have played, again, us influencing the world rather than only us being influenced by the world.
Please bear with us. I want to tease as much out from our panelists, and then we shall open and please put them on the spot. Dr. Tubi, both you and I have just given Ms. Akinduro a doctoral degree. I think I should nominate her for an honorary at UJ, an honorary degree at UJ. So Lebogang, let me push you on two ideas, and let me also use your bathroom mirror. That's quite a new one. I'm going to quote you on that one. First of all, I agree with you that the ramifications of what South Africa did, I said openly in front of the minister the other day, as well as when we hosted the former Turkish Prime Minister last week, that everybody waited for a bold state to do the unthinkable as far as the Israeli suggested genocidal actions are concerned. I said suggested, but in my writings I'm more blunt than that, but for sake of debate. And I openly admitted to the minister that I didn't expect it to be South Africa. But I cannot agree more with Lebogang that the implications globally are enormous. The idea that people from the and countries from the Anglo-Saxon world cannot be held before courts for human rights abuses has been dealt a major body blow. There is a pushback And the new chief prosecutor of the ICC, he was actually grilled in the UN Security Council yesterday. I mean, he is sitting with indictments against Israel. And the Americans literally threatened that he shouldn't dare to go ahead with it. But just the outcomes and the persistence from South Africa, it represents such a high watermark in our foreign policy with enormous ramifications for a more egalitarian world order, as you said, flattened international relations. But if we're going to be fair, and sorry that I'm going to say one or two things about your thesis. In the thesis, you did ask for the decolonization of South Africa's macroeconomic policies, for example.
They did.
There was a time when we retreated from the African agenda. There was a time when we were very active. I can tell you, for example, just as an example, that the only peacekeeping operation we are currently involved in is the one in the DRC. And there are many questions around that. But we've retreated from all peacekeeping operations on the continent. And people even question whether the African agenda remain our number one priority for a long period. How do you respond to this idea that I want to flag? South Africa was so angry by what I've called the rogue actions of the American ambassador around that lady, Lady R, the lady in red, that it brought about a fundamental rethink in South Africa's foreign policy, and there is greater clarity. But combined with that, South Africa is desperate for economic relations with the West, but politically it wants distance and autonomy. Can it, and how should it go about doing that? Just respond for me to those ideas.
Fantastic. And can it do both? And is it one or the other? So again, it's this kind of typical South African, I don't want to call it schizophrenia, but this always balancing between being seen to be Pan-African, pro-African, Africa-centered, while sometimes also being seen as a slightly untrustworthy broker in other spaces. And I mean, I know the conversations that folks have about us in Addis, in New York, in various spaces, and are very concerned about the proliferation of all kinds of think tanks and pseudo-democracy projects, Chris, that have already sprung up across Tshwane, and the huge disproportionate amount of funding and presence of this intellectual work, this intellectual project that seems to be focused on trying to build South Africa as some kind of a bulwark against which the US, perhaps the European Union to some extent, the UK, and to a different extent, China, another extent, India, that we don't speak about anymore, and we should. We actually should, because there's a lot that's happening there as well. But this kind of imbalance, South Africa as the favorite child that not many people want to play with because they are not sure about where our interests ultimately lie. And I think the other idea that this was some sort of a righteous indignation is interesting, but it could not, the coincidence of this indignation a few months before a very important general election, just to loop it back, can also not be understated. I mean, it has done no harm to South Africa, the state, but ANC, the party, to be seen to be leading this kind of global upending of global relations, especially right now. So perhaps it's a cynical view. It's a convenience of virtue, which happens to conflate with an election campaign quite nicely.
Great stuff. And just one point, you don't have to respond to it, because I would like to get to our third panelist. I bet that everybody in this room who got a vaccination during COVID did not get the Russian version or variant or the Chinese. So for all of South Africa's great role it played as a broker for the continent, it was clear that when it used to be close to the West at the time, and all that was available were the Western vaccines, and the Chinese and Russian versions never saw the light of day. There was a time when we were so comfortable to be invited to the G7 clubs, the G20 clubs, but did we always push the African agenda, or was there a deep element of self-interest? Well done, brilliant for those insights. Okay, doctor. So we've got a non-doctor, a doctor-to-be, and a doctor.
Got it.
No, and I want to tell you an interesting story about that. Wasega Barregu, we know him, the late Wasega Barregu. He became more radical the older he became. So every time Adebayo, myself, and him were together, and I was struggling to complete my doctorate, he would do the introductions and say, I'm Professor Barregu. This is Dr. Adebayo, and this is non-Dr. Landsberg. And that inspired me to finish this thing. So to the real doctor that I don't have to nominate for an honorary, at least not yet, speak to us specifically about the politics of just transition. South Africa has come under enormous pressure before the fallout with the West over that lady, and the schisms that have crept in between South Africa and the West. There are differences that have emerged amongst the Western powers, but how do you see this absolutely critical issue playing itself out first in a domestic context, in a coalition context? So you must also play around with some scenarios.
Okay.
Incidentally, Lebogang, I didn't see that non-ANC scenario. I haven't really factored that one in. I must go and play with that scenario where the ANC is sent to the opposition benches. But domestically, and then from the outside, how are certain powers, Germany is in the forefront of this together with other Western powers, how are they likely to react post the 29th of May this year?
All right, thank you very much. Lovely to listen to my colleagues here on the panel. I think the issue of a just energy transition would be critical, or is critical, to the upcoming elections and the post-elections life in South Africa. As we know, energy is critical for development. It has been at the forefront of the new global development agenda. I was saying yesterday when speaking at a panel, saying it's interesting how different global agendas always emerge, and we are always running to catch up. This becomes the site of implementation, or experiment rather, and then we are always soliciting for funding, soliciting for support in order to globalize this agenda, which was never our agenda in the first place. And so when you look around the politics of the just energy transition, key questions that emerge or arises. I mean, South Africa in the continent has been at the forefront of globalizing this agenda, of course, with Rwanda as well, but South Africa in question, given the dynamics of the panel. Questions around the transition has always been what happens to the previous historical mineral energy complex upon which South Africa's development was built. South Africa as a state has been built. How do we move from something that has been the foundation of the development agenda into something, this new experimental way of thinking about energy? And scholars often argue that there has been no country in the world that has gone through a developmental phase as we are now that has done so on solely green energy, which is true. So we've become the guinea pigs. We've become the guinea pigs for the energy transition. And so the politics and how it plays out in South Africa becomes what happens to those in the value chain of the historical energy, mineral energy complex? How do we absorb that labor in this so-called new green energy space, and talks around the fact that most of the people who participate in that historical energy complex value chain have been those with 0 to no skill or have had a certain threshold of education levels. And so the green energy industry is positioning itself as an industry that requires certain skills, certain education levels. And so what happens to the excesses that emerge from this old or industry that is slowly phasing out in South Africa? And that remains a question to be answered. And so when you think about global powers like your Germany, who are pushing for, and of course Western countries that are pushing for a green energy transition, there are certain benefits to them. So we cannot think about it as just being beneficial for developing nations. It is definitely looking for a market for green energy technology. So we cannot have the debate without looking at the flip side of the argument. At the end of the day, mineral resources are not going anywhere. Even if we are moving away from oil or phasing out oil and coal to a certain extent, Africa remains the home for critical mineral resources that are needed for this transition. We still require the critical mineral resources for solar panels. We require them for wind turbines. And so Africa remains central to the debate around the just energy transition. But how do we ensure that the mistakes that we made in the historical energy complex are not repeated now as we move into an era where critical mineral resources are gaining traction? One of them being issues around terms of trade. We don't talk about issues of terms of trade because they're not important, or our resources are being categorized as primary commodities, which is often associated with rubbish, forgive my language, or something that is not of importance. And yet, without these critical resources, without this raw material, nothing else would exist. And so terms of trade needs to be an issue that we talk about, that we push for as we move into this era of critical mineral resources. In terms of where South Africa stands when it comes to the possible coalition, I think the DA has been a champion in the cause of an energy transition.
Surprise, surprise.
Western Cape case study. I mean, when you think about, when scholars talk about the potentiality of the transition actually working, Western Cape becomes the ideal case study. But then you say, oh, but supersize that to a national level. Think about that and control for population growth, control for industrialization. What does the scenario look like? And then there's silence. And so when you see a possible coalition of a DA and ANC, would definitely see South Africa still be the poster child for the just energy transition and pushing for that initiative. But I would definitely like to give the ANC credit because in terms of implementing or looking towards implementing the transition, it has been incremental, intentionally incremental in its position towards the transition because it wants to, as much as possible, be inclusive. It wants to, as much as possible, take care of those who would be disadvantaged by the previous mineral energy complex. In a space where you find the ANC and the EFF, now there we're going to see some wrestling, some real WWE, and some chair throwing because the discourse around coal being the driving resource for the economy and the fact that you cannot have rapid industrialization or the scale of industrialization that South Africa is hoping to achieve just on green energy alone is a viable debate. And so in the case where you have an absence of the ANC, you have a DA, EFF, of course there will still be WWE there as well, because you have the DA at the forefront of the transition and then the EFF pushing for another agenda. Globally, we are seeing that the EU being at the forefront, incorporating different mechanisms into the transition. I think also when you think about the transition, the question is, are we really transitioning, or is this transition a different kind of fast-paced transition? Maybe there's a different type of transition we're not aware about, because transition should be slow. Transition should be incremental. You take a step, you assess the implications, the risks, and then based on the outcomes of those analysis, you move to the next step. But in this case, we are finding that we are being told you're transitioning. However, when you export goods to the EU, we want to make sure that there are green elements to it. So, and prove to us that this was produced in an environmentally conscious way. By 2030, if I'm not mistaken, every good that does not meet those green mechanisms or green indicators would not be received by the EU. But what does that do to our economy? Because now we are being put under pressure, as what Foucault would say, governmentality. So it's not a direct cane in the hand, but this is the way it should be done, you go govern yourself mechanism. And so those are the kind of quagmire we're finding ourselves in when it comes to the just energy transition globally and in South Africa.
I promise you I'll come to you. So I owe you a follow-up question as well, just to be even-handed. Mm-hmm. The exploitation of African minerals, thinly disguised as Africa Rising, mm-hmm. right, is at play. But there's also the reality that African agency mm-hmm. has been weakened during the course of the last decade and a half. Mm-hmm. African unity is, to put it mildly, feeble at best. What should a South Africa do, given a newly established legitimacy globally through the ICJ and its actions there? It has really given South Africa standing in the world mm-hmm. A big shot in the arm again. Mm-hmm.
Definitely, I do agree that the push to take Israel to the ICJ was definitely a good move for South Africa, restating itself as one of the countries with a high moral compass, prioritizing human rights and human security above national interest. But I think the challenge remains that South Africa would need to, in the post-elections, upcoming elections, would need to reestablish itself and that identity in Africa. In the last 10 years, South Africa's position and how its Africanness has been questioned because of especially migration issues around trade as well in the region, has been championed for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but only now on the 31st of January 2024 did it launch its first trade agreement under the AFTA. Which of course it's basically trading with 12 countries, so SACU plus other countries, Algeria, Egypt, Ghana, and the likes. And so post the election, South Africa would have to balance its national interest, that's one, with regional interest, with an African interest, especially on the issue of migration. And even when you look at the ANC's manifesto, I mean, very interesting for me, just taking a look at the different manifestos, issues around its position in the continent is the 6th priority, okay? And for me, the discourse around that says a lot. So prior to that, of course, national interest comes first, ensuring that South Africans are able to work, ensuring that it advances its economic interests globally. But issues around dealing and prioritizing the needs of the continent is the 6th. I think in the manifesto there's 6 or 7 priorities, is the last priority, and that positioning itself says a lot. And so post-election, the challenge would be how do you, not necessarily exert, but how do you recuperate your Africanness, not just within SADC, but within the African continent?
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Bayo, thank you very much for asking me to be the moderator. I would have made a complete fool of myself if I joined this panel. That was really excellent. The floor is open. Raise your hand, introduce yourself. If you would like to share your bank account details with us, we shall accept that. But I'm going to take 4 hands and a second round, and somebody must just indicate and read for me some questions in the clouds. Right. So I saw first hand, second, Dr. Edigeji, third, fourth. Those 4. 1, gentleman with a absolutely beautiful blue suit. You should tell us where he bought it. I would like to buy one. Over there, Dr. Edigeji here. Put up your hand, Momano. And then there, yeah. So center right and center left. That's where they are.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Suad. I work for the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa in Addis Ababa. But thank you for the panelists, very insightful interventions. Since this morning at the first panel, actually, the gentleman in a blue suit was actually on the panel this morning. I had wanted to ask the same question. We keep referring to the African Union as if it is a supranational organization like EU. It's a big mistake. It is not. It's at best a platform for heads of state to network and pronounce themselves. Declarations. They are not implementable immediately, simply because the way we have organized, no government, none of them ever gave to African Union any power over it. Unlike the RECs, for example. The RECs are more supranational than the continental platform, for sure. Some of what they say is actually binding to their members. But here we are with and I like when Prof. Lukoshi this morning was talking with a lot of emotions, as he usually does as a Pan-Africanist, the move from the OAU to the AU, the renaissance. It didn't help that they still don't pay for their institution, that it is almost subdued to European Union. So you have these colleagues who go around in nice suits, carrying a logo that is African, that's as if there is something called Africa that belongs to this stuff, that are basically reporting back. The contributions at best pay for the positions within the African Union, but not for the work they do. So basically, the programming of the entire African Union Commission is decided somewhere else. And I absolutely like what Lebohang was saying. Whether it is Paris, New York, Brussels, Berlin, Bonn, that's Washington and New York, that's where the programming of the African Union and the priorities are. So how do you even forge a narrative in that context, let alone defending it? So then comes the RECs. Now, ECOWAS was the most advanced region, integrated economically. And here we are in front of a situation where 3 members left on the ground that the institution is so captured that it is working against the interests of its members. So at continental level, we have an institution we don't pay for. We never give capacity or weight to. And at regional level, where it is a little bit more binding what we do there, because we don't come and vent or talk and take pictures and come back and forget about what we said in Addis Ababa. But here is a case where we are saying this isn't working for me. So where are the institutions that are supposed to so this Africa we keep talking about, where are the institutions that are supposed to? Now we bring it back to who pays for them. African Development Bank is the premier policy organ of the continent, policy financial financial institution of the continent. By shareholding, it is not African. The decision-making, the board of the ADB blocks anything that is Pan-African. The current president, within his first mandate, when he came up with something called the High Five, was almost posed for impeachment. They took us all the way to Busan to impeach him. So we are talking about a continent where, at continental level, we can't speak properly. At regional level, we don't respect ourselves to the point where our institutions are respected and they respect their members. And here we are with the financing of that, because you do need to organize yourself. We can't continue to talk about the West Side and whatever. But how do you organize when you don't even have your own institution and your own funding? So the question I wanted to ask really to my sisters here, we're saying that our countries are not truly independent. That was one of the things that came out from this morning. Can they afford to be?
Okay.
Do they have that luxury of choosing the policies at this stage still, 2024, 60 years after?
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you very much. As the mic makes its way, I'm part of a group where we debate African issues, Waza Africa, and recently Prof. Gabela Matlosa put a picture on the group, the old ECOWAS that says ECOWAS, and then the new ECOWAS without the three ECO-E's. That's what he said. Please.
Ouch.
Okay, my name is Remy Ajibewa. I was the Director of Political Affairs in ECOWAS for 18 years and Director of Political
Oh, I'm sorry. Forget about what I just said about ECOWAS.
And apparently,
no, that was terrible timing.
Apparently, right now, I'm with the National Institute of Policy and
He's moved.
Studies as ambassadorial fellow there. So then earlier in academia as well for some 16 years. So apparently, my question is foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. And looking at the trajectory from 1994 till now, we know that the founding fathers like Mandela, like Thabo Mbeki, as well as Jacob Zuma, they did, and then Cyril Ramaphosa. They've done a lot, but there's a question now with the internal dynamics. We all know it, looking at the issue of corruption, which has been talked about, looking at the other dynamics. Are they in a better position to continue the foreign policy posture that the country has been known? For example, given the fact that the Constitution, what the three said, there are certain strands that goes through the issue of the Constitution, which is primary, talking about the issue of national interest, power, and the values. And the value is of corruption when you look at it. And that also determines how the outside world looks at the country at times. We have examples of some countries that are giants, but at the same time, when they look at this issue of corruption, that it is not being addressed, either at the private or at the government level, it tends to bring in some issue. But interest will always be there. Whether it is the ANC or the opposition or a coalition, the interest will always be there. The interest is that they will be members of those countries. And then the immediate environment, the neighbors, will be a sort of concentric circle in which they have to deal with, which they have been dealing with now. But there is a problem. The problem is the issue with the internal, you send people out, now you have to withdraw, so to make sure that even the internal problem, which we all know about, even if it's crime, you have to bring in people if it's the other section. So those areas are areas where there should be a sort of balance in the foreign policy picture, but you must look at it in a balanced dimension. Then the third one is the power relations as well as you've said it, Nigeria is also contending, Algeria, Egypt. This is the third largest military power here in Africa. When you look at Egypt, Algeria, and then Nigeria came fourth. So looking at those dynamics, there's also a need for foreign policy rethinking with any new government that comes in. And against that background, I will also want to say there's a need to exploit the dynamics of the tension now. And I'm very, very optimistic, as I've said in the earlier one. Whether the ANC will have +1, that is another issue. But the only thing is that the electorate will decide. But for the international community and then the foreign policy posture, I think being a member of BRICS is a good point. Then the liberation movement, supporting liberation movement. So those issues of non-dynamic should be a continuation, whether any government comes in or not. There is a continuation rather than changing certain principles.
Thank you. Thank you for that no-holds-barred contribution. And please just remove that echo-east thing. ECOWAS. We talk about ECOWAS. Dr. Adegeji?
Thank you, Professor Landsberg. I think this is the first time for more than some decades that you have not bullied me. So congratulations for not being a bully today.
I used to be his boss.
He used to be my boss, and he bullied me.
Wow.
You still haven't come for the DC. Carry on.
Let me ask one direct question, then another one that will be more nuanced. Nigeria is quite clear from independence that Africa is the centerpiece of its foreign policy. In the post-election period, after May 29, can South Africa be that forthright with the continent and its people that Africa is the centerpiece of its foreign policy? So that is the direct one. Then I think there's a more nuanced one, and we have to find a way to change the narrative about the continent. Contested election. The 2020 election in the US is still being contested. And it does not in any way delegitimize the US or even the government. I remember in 2010, I was in the Netherlands, and they could not form a government. Nobody said it delegitimized Netherlands in its internal processes, as well as its engagement with the world. The contestation of the election, let us have the election. If it has to be contested, it will be contested. We should trust our judicial system to be able to address any challenges that arises. Then let me also say, within the continent, the African leaders will rally around if the ANC emerges. It will rally around that. Anybody who's thinking about any other thing, it may not be on this continent. But on this continent, they will rally around. These people speak almost every day because they have a common agenda. We may not agree with everything that they do. And some of the dynamics that are at play, we may not also understand them. You will only understand them when you sit on the table. So let's say even the EFF you make an EFF person the Minister of Energy, right?
They want economics, but anyway, carry on.
Yes.
They want finance.
Okay, yes. You even give them finance. It is when you sit on the table, there are various considerations that you have to make. So I am very positive about the outcome of the election. I am also very positive. And Chris, please, could you tell your fellow commentators about their projection, say the ANC will not get this and that. Where is the scientific evidence? Where is the data? I would be interested to see. You and I know most of these commentators sit in their homes. Some of them claim they were economists until we later find out they were not. They claim what they are not. So South Africans will decide. And we all should rally around the decision that South Africans will take on the 29th. The issue of its legitimacy will only be determined by South Africans. And South Africans will engage on the continent, we hope more robustly, Chris, and also with the international community.
Thank you very much. By the way, I'm not a member of that club. I don't go on radio and TV and speak about elections. I try to stay in my lane. I even worry that there might be a drone waiting for me somewhere. I stick to my issue. But just for your information, Prof. Olukoshi, next Friday at UJ, we're actually having an event like this, commenting on the commentators. So we're actually bringing analysts, right? These people who speak, and we're going to force them to make predictions. And then after the election, we'll call them back. Come and account for your predictions. But we're really going to have some of you, I've just saw 3 excellent candidates next week Friday.
Game theorist.
The gentleman over there.
No, thank you, Prof. I'm Fanelo Ntsobi. I'm with Saibono Discovery Center. And in terms of my scholarship, I'm affiliated with the Global Center for Academic Research as a research professor. Prof, the commentators, especially
The commentariat.
the panelists, especially Ms. Peko, as she shared the scenarios with us, there's one scenario that was missing. I'm not sure if that was deliberate. The possibility of the ANC emerging victorious again. What does that mean? So if you can just include that. I attended a lot of these seminars here at WITS. The recent one, Prof. Olukoshi, was a debate on the impact of the South African elections on SADC. Even though the discussion was somehow nuanced, it was gravitating towards an assertion that even if South Africa's elections were to be successful, it would mean nothing. In fact, the role of South Africa in the past 30 years in SADC has been disappointing. And that ignited an idea in me, of course, out of disappointment. I mean, a country that has been so bold to challenge Israel at the ICJ, standing, on the courage of its moral and political conviction. Yet, South African scholars, regional scholars are saying its role in the past 30 years in SADC has been disappointing. But there was context, of course. We need to be honest as scholars as well. I was almost persuaded that its immigration policy, its emphasis on its foreign policy, especially during the current elections, and how they are managing issues of migration. However, for me, I have participated in all the democratic elections, and I'm about to participate in the forthcoming elections, God forbid, if I'm still alive, of course. Now, what is the uniqueness of these elections? You know, as a scholar, I've tried to investigate what is the uniqueness of these elections. Some even refer to these elections as 1994. They are 1994 elections. But I've looked, because elections for me are about the voters' roll, among others. In terms of the number of people who are registered to vote, I don't see a significant change. Secondly, I know, to us, it's almost a tradition in South Africa. You know, it's a good culture that we go and vote, and our elections have always been peaceful. And the one measure for me was, hey, let's see, why are they saying this? Are we going to see the postponement of elections and that get contested, which what you were saying, Prof, that most of these decisions, political decisions, are taken in court? No. Regular elections, the date has not changed significantly. Can you please share your insights? What is unique about the 2024 elections? Thank you so much.
Excellent question. Are there any questions from the cloud online? Nothing. That question you've just asked, in this piece that I referred to, that I penned with Ibrahim Fakir, we actually answer why 2024 resembles 1994 in a sense, right? But I'm not a panelist. I'm going to leave it over to, so non-doctor, Akinduro.
Thank you.
It's to inspire you to come and see us for a scholarship.
I'm gingering myself. but thank you.
Please pick up on any one or two that you feel comfortable with.
I have identified a few, and I think the good thing about being the non-doctor is you can leave the bigger ones to the in the making and the real, and then the professor. It just works nicely.
No, but today I'm not the professor, I'm the bouncer. Carry on.
Okay, I think I would like to comment on the issue around the African Union and the REX. Actually, one of the points I was going to raise at the beginning was also to say that the elections we'll see on the continent this year will be a big test for the powers of the regional authorities. The AU, I mean, like she clearly pointed out, is a different animal. But when we think about the REX, questions around ECOWAS, ECOEAS, three states leaving. These states have elections scheduled, but we are now close to June. Between you and I, we don't see any of those elections likely to take place. Now, what does this mean for democratic transitions in the space? Mali, for instance, has been in that cycle for the last 2, and now it's going to continue. 2 years thereabout, but it will continue. Guinea doesn't look like there's going to be any end to that loop. So it then brings, to fore the question of what really is the relevance of our regional institutions. And with that said, I would then like to loop into the fact that there will be EU elections this year, where you have a space where the ordinary citizen has a say in sending representative to a regional parliament. And that parliament is quite important in making, laws across. So whether it's issues of cybersecurity, energy, whatever it is, the pronouncements of the European Union comes as one voice. And that leads to where you're talking about the UK post-Brexit? Where has that left, the UK? Because now we really can now see glaringly what it means to be outside that bigger space of the European Union where there's a stronger voice. Now, is it then time for us to return and look inwards? We have the Pan-African Parliament, but what really is the relevance of that institution? Does it actually speak for any African state? Right now, it doesn't, even though there is an aspiration that at some point it will gain the status of really being a regional legislative institution. But if it is set up in a way that the average citizen does not have a direct voice in that, how would we ever, reach that space? But my point is, it certainly is time to look inwards. With the African Union and the question of funding, it is, really questionable when we think about countries that we call Pan-Africanists, but then what are the contributions towards a strong African Union? And contributions start financially. So that's my first response. The next will be on the issue of disputed elections, questions of legitimacy of incoming governments. I think it's also important to dig slightly deeper into what sort of disputes are we talking about. Like I said before, it wouldn't be the first disputed election in South Africa. But what's the nature of disputes? Are we at the stage where we are saying there was 2 votes at my polling station, but it became 20 when it got to the National Tally Center? That is so far away from the kinds of disputes you hear. So there is more questions around interpretation of laws in South Africa. There's more questions around questions of eligibility, the right to vote, the right to be voted for, higher level kind of questions. And that's why you end up then not having a very direct, link to questions of legitimacy. But when you move to other contexts where we are questioning issues of numbers, how many people turned out to vote? How did we get to the final, results of this? So the point is this, I made a point before that institutions in South Africa have continued to show their strength. The IEC being one of those, where it is really hard for you to get to that question of, I want to question your 1 vote versus 10 votes. But there can be, broader questions around the legal framework. And of course, any country going through the kinds of changes we've seen in the system in South Africa in the last years doesn't then surprise me that we have so many questions going to court. So maybe by the time we finish with 2024 and we see how these changes play out, then let's wait and see if we will continue to have such a highly litigated process. Significance of 2024, I haven't seen your paper. I wish I could get a peep into you and Ibrahim's paper. But I think there are quite a number of things that set it apart. I think first, the changes in the system and the fact that this is really a huge experiment for South Africa's democracy, like I said before. It's one. It's also the fact that reforms have been undertaken. One trend you find across the continent, yes, everybody talks about reforms, but how do those reforms happen? To what extent are reform processes hijacked to serve a completely different purpose when they start out with a sincere question, but then in a matter of months or years, you find it completely derailed. And then by the end of the process, you have a legal framework that everybody is asking, how did we get here? Let's look at Togo, for instance. The decision quite recently to change electoral system. But let's move that versus what is happening in South Africa. So for me, there are quite a number of significant tests of South Africa's commitment to democratic principles that we will see in the 2024 elections. They might not be completely appreciated internally, but for those of us looking at South Africa from the outside, those experiments, in quote, those tests of different principles really matter a lot. And we can start looking at South Africa as, could we really then, start looking at other countries and say, what does the journey of democracy really mean? Quite, we talk about democratic development like it's one line, there's a transition, and then there's consolidation, and we keep moving. But it's really not a one-line, straight-line journey. But South Africa, has proven that you could stop at different points in the process, make significant changes, but do you still remain a strong democracy after that? That, for me, is what is most, I would consider quite significant for these elections. Yeah.
Excellent. Deboham, Beko.
Testing. I think that there are a few things. 2024, we are in community with so many other jurisdictions. This is, we use the word unprecedented in unprecedented ways, but we are indeed at a place where I think about 2 billion people or so are going to be transacting power from one set of hands to the other, or circulating it across class interests, across economic interests, across ethno-nationalist interests, but power is, and also generational interests, which is something that I think we should briefly talk about. And that's what makes this, in addition to what my learned Dr.to-be has said, is very, very important. The fact that we're also able to test out the power of independent candidacy. In this country. If you have enough signatures, you, me, or anybody in a blue shirt can potentially run for office. And this means that we're also building in an immediacy to processes, to electoral processes that perhaps hasn't been tested before. And this sets us apart, I think, from what people would call the democracy. So I have a house full of critiques about why we're calling this a democracy when only about 35% of people actually voted in the ANC previously. And this links to what both of the good colleagues said around what is the scenario of the ANC coming back into office? Is that actually a victory? And I'd like to respond to that this way. Firstly, to say that bipartisan politics in the US, in the UK, seem to have calcified politics there, seem to have calcified processes there, seem to have calcified the ways in which processes, institutions, and the polity can grow dynamically, and have almost flattened out the possibility of having different streams of thinking. It's just it's shades of purple and lavender, as far as I can see. When you look at the Democrats versus the Republicans, it's shades of purple. It's blue and red there, but to us, we're looking at lavender, particularly in the context of their foreign policy and their international relations, which is America first or UK first. There's not much on paper that's essentially different. I would suggest that we don't want to go that flat route. We also don't want to go the route of the Xenofication, the ANCification, the swapofication of what is really a semblance and an overflow of very contested liberation dogmas and liberation factions, which have seen themselves playing out post-1994. So for people who perhaps are from different and multiple political traditions, who understand that the ANC did not bring democracy, many liberation traditions were part of bringing democracy such as it is, or liberation, such as, similar to Zimbabwe. There was ZAPU, there was ZANU. But what happens when you have an electoral contestation and political contestation is that all of these other elements are flattened and unremembered. And I think that's very, very dangerous, actually. I'd also suggest that then if we say that, would that be a victory? I don't think any single party, whether that be the Conservatives, Labour, Republicans, whoever, I don't think any single party should have such a strong monopoly on power, on access to state resources, on access to democratic dividends, on access to institutional power and priority for 3 decades. I would find that incredibly unhealthy and going into the realm of the putrefaction that we have seen north of the Limpopo, as we often like to say. I think that's a dangerous place to go, and it flattens out the many multiple intergenerational interests that we should be ushering in. And again, 30 years, there are people who are not born when Nelson Mandela and when the ANC and the PAC and AZAPO and other liberation movements were unbanned. They have no recollection of that. And I wonder whether we want to hold them hostage to the past or whether we want them to be able to plot out a revolutionary future that is bedded in today's concrete conditions, not the concrete conditions of Arusha 19 Mang Mang, Lusaka 19 Mang Mang, way back when, Addis 1961. Perhaps we want to allow them to respect the historiography and the hagiography of liberation struggles, but then to carve out the values that are important to themselves, because being 30 in 2024 versus being 30 in 1994 and versus being 30 in 1964 are completely different undertakings.
Great stuff. Doctor.
Yeah, the real doctor in the house.
God.
Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. I actually had a question for you, but am I allowed to ask the non-doctor a question? Is it?
Yeah, in fact, this debate has been going too well. Have a go at each other.
Okay. No,
Go for it.
when you were speaking about South Africa being a lesson that we could learn and a lens through which we could look at other polities in the continent, I was wondering how you see this playing out in countries where it is so deeply rooted, that the national politics is deeply rooted in ethno-religious dynamics. So how do you see democracy playing out in those types of contexts? But to answer the question about whether we can afford to be independent, we can afford, but we choose not to afford. And that's because we are, I don't want to say we are because I'm not, but that generation of people seem to be deeply, for whatever reason, entrenched in the cycle of being dependent or seen to be dependent on. And this is a problem I think Prof. Olukoshi and his cohort need to address because they are they are the forefront of ensuring that this dynamic changes. But it's the same way we talk about aid and how it functions or what the detriments are to us, to our development, and the fact that we always choose the easy way out of going to beg for funding in order to finance some or service certain public debt or finance development project, as opposed to doing the hard work of one, demanding what is owed to us. Again, I keep saying this, that we talk about development in a very evasive sense, that it's something that would just come to us, but we need money to finance it. And where do we get this money from? First of all, if we are not paid correctly, what our economies, the mainstays of our economies, if we're not paid what we should be earning from those resources, then where does the excess come from in the first place? We have no choice than to go beg. And then when we beg, we are being called certain names. We are being categorized as low income, developing, middle income, almost income. And then those categories follow us when we participate in global affairs. It affects our agency in deciding whether or not to take Israel to the ICJ, or even having a stronger voice and castigating Russia or NATO for its activities or wanting to extend itself towards Russia. And so it all comes down to our ability or how we structure our economies and how much we demand for our resources, and that affects the policy. So it always comes back to the political economy of how we structure our respective economies. So we can be independent, or we can afford to be independent, but we choose not to be independent. I do agree, foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. And what we are seeing when it comes to South Africa, especially its politics within SADC, its politics within Africa, is audience cost. Audience cost in South Africa is very costly. And so the populist narrative on migration has always been categorized as Afrophobic, xenophobic, and the likes, especially where employment is concerned, wanting to protect access to jobs for South Africans and preferring South Africans over foreigners. But even in that narrative, there are categories to foreign. The victims here seems to be African foreigners, but not Chinese foreigners. It seems to be African foreigners, but not European foreigners. And so the politics in that, the fact that it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's not a foreign versus us, that is what we're problematizing, and that's why we keep saying, or the African scholars keep saying, that there is a need for South Africa to be intentional in how it addresses issues around migration, because it's not a broad stroke. There are levels to the game, if I'm to put it that way, and African foreigners seems to be at get the shortest end of the stick. So there is that dynamic. I do agree, but audience cost has been one of the reasons, or the main reasons, why South Africa's foreign policy has been towards prioritizing its domestic interest over regional and Africa's interest. Can South Africa be forthright that Africa is the centerpiece? On paper, yes. In practice, no. Audience cost. I hope I answered your question.
Wow. I want to have a crack, Omano, with your question as well as Prof, your question. But let me leave it for last if we have time. Let me take a final round. So this is it. As Michael Jackson said, this is it. Please put up your hand and grab this last opportunity. Is that Dr. Shilau?
Yes, it is.
Wow. Okay. Dr. Shilau. So that's the far right. Another hand over here. So 1, 2, 3. What took you so long? 3. Going.
Yeah.
No, I'll in my wrap up, I'll respond. Going. It's over.
Okay.
It's over. I don't want to see you anymore. It's over. Dr. Shilau.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you, panelists, for your incisive interventions.
Yeah.
The question
Here comes some fireworks, eh? Be ready.
to AK, but the rest can have a crack at it. AK, you, and I do agree with you, when you say South Africa's taking Israel and its allies before the International Court of Justice is a marker of moral leadership globally. That's correct. Who else could do it? These are big guns. Only South Africa has the guts to do that. But then that speaks to another problematic issue of South African exceptionalism. Because the question is, where's this moral leadership, this moral voice, when it comes to similar atrocities on the continent? You know, conflict has played itself out in Ethiopia, the Tigray region, and atrocities not so dissimilar from the ones that are happening in the Gaza Strip happened. There was silence on the continent. Pretoria was silent. There was no moral position on the issue. So why the Gaza Strip? Previously, Zimbabwe, similar atrocities were taking place under Robert Mugabe. There was no moral position on the question. Sudan, it has dissolved into civil war. Why? So is it a question of South African exceptionalism? You know, a country on the continent, but different. You know, it plays at that stage, at the global stage, with the big guns and can lock horns with the big guns. The wars on the continent are atavistic. Those ones, you know, can be left to play themselves out. So respond to that. Secondly, also there has been this position that leaders who have got issues in their backyard domestically, you know, clearly having talked about the interface between domestic politics and international politics, tend to want to, you know, have a say on global issues as a way of deflecting attention from their embattlement at home, as it were. So Cyril Ramaphosa, for instance, here, some would say is embattled at home. Questions of legitimacy and inability to really, you know, engage that gear and distinguish himself from his predecessor, who was highly discredited. So what do? To cover for that, you appear on the global stage. And you know, people could very easily forgive you domestically. Nkrumah did that. In Ghana, things were going haywire, but he was all over the place. You know, he wants to find out what's happening in China, in Indonesia, but then they told him, stay there, don't come home. Corruption has really run helter-skelter. Thabo Mbeki again, he was all over the continent. But at home, he had issues domestically, as far as governance was concerned. That's why he was recalled, you know, ignominiously. So could you please comment on those things? Thank you.
Thank you. There was crisp and yeah. What else can I say? Yeah, the gentleman here, Or we should have been more economical and just.
Thank you very much, Professor and dear panelists. My name is Mohammed Yasir. I'm a visiting researcher at the Department of International Relations at WITS. Although some of you touched upon this issue, but I want to get your concrete ideas. So what would be the potential short to mid-term implications of the election outcomes and the government formation on both the current events between Israel and Palestine and South Africa's foreign policy towards Israel? Does this make sense?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Short and to the point. Last but by no means least.
Afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone, for such a very rich and very decadent conversation. I think since this morning it's been very
decadent.
Excuse me?
Decadent.
No, decadent.
Okay.
It's been a very decadent day for discussing this subject matter. And also an insight as to what's going on with the lobbying behind the scenes leading up to the elections. That's very interesting. I don't know how the DA and the ANC will work out a foreign policy position on Israel, but let's see. I want to just come back. This is applicable to anybody who feels they want to answer. On South African foreign policy. And thank you again for orienting the conversation around what the implications of which party rules for SA foreign policy, because that's very imperative from SADC, continental to global. I hadn't really put all these other factors that you've presented into mind. I'd like to know what kind of changes and reorientations do we need for our foreign policy, given such a rapidly evolving and changing global landscape and very charged landscape on a multilateral level, specifically at the UN. What kind of adaptations are we going to have to make? Chris, this is specifically for you. I want to talk to you about the quote-unquote national interest document that was devised by DIRCO about 2 years ago now. And what this election now is going to mean for that document. I still haven't read totally through it, but do we need to perhaps toss that out and now we're going to have to go back to the drawing board, given the fact that when we drew up that document, the current global environment and temperature was not as charged, the domestic politics were not where they were, the geopolitical environment globally has taken a tectonic shift. What does that mean? Also, is there sufficient consultation around the formulation of the national interest document? Should it solely be something for DIRCO to look at? Is it sufficient for them? Another question I would like to know, again for all the panelists, how are we going to balance all of our obligations in our new foreign policy orientation and or document around BRICS, around Africa, and around our UN obligations? Lastly, what is happening at the AU? I think I'm a bit concerned personally as to what is the institution, what does it mean, not just for Africa and Africans, but for us as South Africans. We consistently and always say, you know, our policy, our foreign policy is always, you know, we've got an African-oriented foreign policy. What does that mean right now? You know, who's the custodian of this Pan-African narrative, if it even exists? And where is the institution going, more importantly?
Thank you. Prof. Bayo, you will notice that the last question was asked at exactly 4:30. So I don't think we're doing too badly with time. So let me now go from the extreme left to the extreme right. So Doc, I'll start with you.
Okay.
And I will have a crack at just one or two things, not that it'll be insightful, just be warned.
Thank you, Dr. Weston, for your comment and question. Yes, talks around South Africa's exceptionalism, especially when it comes to when you juxtapose its affairs or how proactive it has been in the continent versus outside of the continent. And some would even argue that it kind of takes an Mbeki posture where it prioritizes the outside over the inside. But it doesn't mean that South Africa has not been proactive, I think, within the continent, because it is battling with that identity of being a hegemon, but also being a team player. You often find it allowing the AU as an institution to take the lead. And yes, they like the critique in terms of sending troops to the DRC, to CAR, and then the audience cost, and then needing to pull them out at the same time. So it has been an interesting balancing act for the South African government when it comes to exerting itself in the region, in Africa, and globally. And so some scholars, like yourself, refer to that as South Africa being an exceptionalist country, or considering itself as too good to involve itself in Africa's politics, but being more befitting for global affairs. And so it's open for debate, but in terms of my opinion, I think that there is more, in terms of how it positions itself, there seems to be a belief that there is more to gain from the outside world than there is from the African continent, which is also, on the flip side, a call, a clarion call to African government to at least improve their respective entities or polities to a position where, you know, advanced countries in the continent are open, are willing, are excited to engage politically, economically, and otherwise. So we cannot necessarily blame South Africa for wanting to, you know, be this authority in global affairs. And it also becomes a gateway for every other country in the continent, you know, to take advantage. It leads the way, opens the doors, and every other country gets invited to the table. Example, the G20, and the African Union being the newest member of the G20. So, I mean, depending on I know that you do refer to that, to South Africa and South Africa's exceptionalism as a scholar. That was my question, right?
Great stuff. Lebogang?
Yes.
Ms. Pekel?
Yes, Prof. Multilateralism and the UN, and what changes, I think, once there is a new government in whatever configuration, whether it is a diminished ANC, whether it is EFF plus ANC, ANC with sprinkles of DA, EFF with sprinkles of DA and other all the other political formations. I do think what happens in that regard is that we're going to have to then look a bit more carefully around the distinction between having a foreign policy and international relations. And these are always often used interchangeably. And foreign policy is South Africa first, right? South Africa abroad, or Nigeria abroad, Kenya abroad, the US first. As obnoxious as it may sound, but it is about how a country positions themselves in relation to the world, whereas international relations is much more dealing with community and polity and shared governance, which is why spaces like the BRICS, with a house full of critiques I may have about it, like SADC, like the African Union, whether or not it is indeed a supranational body or not, which indeed it is not. They have much more import in that regard. But I think what also is to link back to the first question around exceptionalism is, remember also that South Africa got a big bloody blue eye straight at the beginning, 1990 Mang, when Nelson Mandela tried to prevail against, I think it was Nigeria, Abacha, around the extrajudicial assassination or execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa. And nobody else backed that position. And I think that one also has to understand the afterlife of that in terms of state relations, in terms of Nigeria and South Africa's complicated relationship to this day, and in terms of how the rest of the continent at that time began to view South Africa, firstly as the new kid on the block with this moral authority foisted on us, it has to be said, and how then this has been translated as, please help us to solve our problems. Please help us with our different, geopolitical complexities like CAR, like Congo, like Zimbabwe. And I think that the challenge that Dr. here also gives us is, what is the role then of supporting South Africa and supporting our institutions to enable us to take much more collective action, to enable us to act in community with each other without promoting this idea that one particular country is somehow infringing on, imposing on others. Whereas when we also see what happens when there's a vacuum as well. So you ask a question, but where were you in DRC? But where were you in Sudan, in Somalia? The question could also be asked, but where was Egypt? But where was Nigeria? But where was Algeria? But where was Botswana? But where were any other number of the polity? So I think we also need to think through, what does it mean to be a community of states, to then begin to then pull back on these, on the idea that one is the one that's ever borrowing, lending the sugar, whether or not the sugar is even wanted, by the way. The other piece on that is then the Palestine versus Israel. I'll go back to my original response, which is it all depends on which conflation, which combination of constellation of parties come into office on May the 30th, I suppose, or post-May 29th. But the one is to then realize that there's going to have to be a shift away from what has traditionally been an ANC-ist centered foreign policy in relation to Israel and Palestine, versus what would be a government state which is perhaps in a coalition with other parties. It might change, and what is the kind of wrestling that will take place? Because again, that is the hangover of liberation policy, then enacting itself in a party which up to now has had a fairly comfortable majority and has then been able to infuse statist liberation politics into national foreign policy. What looks like post May 29th remains to be seen, and I'm not going to be one of the people, I hope, at Chris's crystal ball session next week. So fortunately, I don't have to pronounce on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Lebogang. Ms. Olufontu, I can do miss.
This is it. This is it.
Finally got it right.
I mean, you got it right, yes. Thank you. I think I'll just probably just respond to your question, because I think all the other questions have been touched on. And I hope I'm right that your question is, if we're looking at South Africa as a lesson for others, what do we say to spaces where ethno-religious issues are the main foundations of politics? Is that what your question is? I think I'll start from the point that every country, you know, has come through different historical paths. And South Africa's experience in a space where, you know, its constitution and institution building processes had a completely different space for negotiation, long-term processes of national discourse. I think that really very much sets South Africa apart from spaces where either those negotiations were done in the space of colonialism or the space of military transitions, where everybody was given a date. Okay, the military government has come in, you have 6 months to complete. I think South Africa had the space to have the '94 elections, but then there was then the space to have national discourse around building the constitution. What sort of constitution do we want? What sort of institutions will insulate us, you know, against the long background of questions around race, ethnicity, and all those kinds of questions? I think African countries have gone through it differently. And that, I think, also then comes to the question of the kinds of transitions we are now having. The 3 countries that have chosen to leave ECOWAS, because this whole type of transition where we come and we say you have 1 year, whatever somersaults you want to do in that 1 year, get it done and over with, and let's see return to constitutional order. The African Union not being able over the years to actually sit with these countries and say, what does a return to constitutional order mean? I mean, generally, it has always revolved around write a document that we can call a constitution and hold elections. And thereafter, we all get on our planes and we leave. South Africa had that space to say there is an election, but then after an election, what comes next for us to really say we have completed the process of a transition? And I think that really is the difference, because you can look at Kenya. Kenya did have a chance to discuss a constitution post the 2008 election violence, but it was in a different type of space compared to South Africa. Nigeria, on the other hand, you know, we talk about the need for a national conference since '99, and that hasn't, you know, still come. South Sudan, now there's talk about an election in December, and there's even no constitution to guide that process. So, you know, it's really, for me, that would be the difference. Yeah.
So just to build on that, just allow me a few comments on a few issues, Bio, and 1 or 2 questions were asked for me to respond to. But just to build on that point, there's another unique contextual reality that we have to remind ourselves about South Africa. That if it wasn't for Western triumphalism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the supposed end of the Cold War, we would not probably have had the kind of transition that we had. We were pushed and nudged by both sides of the global ideological divide. Gorbachev with Glasnost perestroika, Western powers, they will put pressure on the National Party and others. The Soviet Union will push the ANC to the negotiation table. The good thing, though, is the ANC were always in favor of a negotiated solution and other liberation movements. And yet, in spite of being pushed, or notwithstanding that they were nudged and pushed to the negotiating table and threatened with punitive measures if they don't do so, they insisted that the negotiations will be owned by South Africa. The fact that Zimbabwe's liberation was attained through a Lancaster negotiation is part of the problem in Zimbabwe. It's not owned by Zimbabweans, right? So I really like the point you made, that South Africa's happened at the end of the Cold War. Other African countries during the Cold War. I was always worried and wrote about that what will happen the day that the ruling party that brought independence to Botswana will lose the election? Will they accept the election? And voila, South Africa is not that exceptional. We can look to Botswana and say that there was a peaceful transition after, 5 decades? So I just want to throw that in there. Let me respond to the xenophobia issue. This is very key. Don't underestimate how successful the National Party and H.F. Verwoerd in particular, he was not the first prime minister that brought apartheid, but he was called the father of grand apartheid for a reason. He went for the mind. He brought Bantu education. He brought Bantu stance. He brought grand apartheid. Listen, let's really undereducate the black men and women in South Africa to the extent that apartheid will long survive, long after it is formally no longer on the statute books. And what we have a terrible situation that this hierarchy of races, whites at the top, followed by Indians, followed by coloreds, and then by what we call Africans, as if colored folk are not Africans, right? But let me leave that aside. Africans. So this notion of as long as I trample on the other, and the one below me on the other, and the one below me on the other, it had such a devastating effect on us that black South Africans and the Gator Mackenzies of the world have been so indoctrinated by the apartheid project that we now take out our issues and anger on black Africans from the Limpopo. So somebody else must be more inferior than me. That's the apartheid project. But I'm not here to make excuses for government. I don't think government tackled this issue enough. Let me put it in the form of foreign policy. South Africa wanted to lead the African Renaissance, but it didn't build an African Renaissance constituency to allow it to back that up. And it brings me to Omano's very important questions. First of all, I want to agree with you. Maybe the issue is not the contestation, and we shouldn't worry too much about the outcome on the 29th. I actually have faith in the IEC. I tell you what I am concerned about. I'm concerned about levels of violence amongst politicians and those that were there and close to state resources and now losing state resources and going after each other. Look at KwaZulu-Natal. This thing is ingrained at every election. I mean, KwaZulu-Natal has now made a unique contribution to world affairs, contract killings, right? Going after politicians. I'm really worried about that. Let me tell you what I'm worried about as well. That where the DA is likely to win, and this province is up for grabs, the heartland, will we have a situation that the black-dominated parties who will now lose will make it ungovernable for the DA, and we will have this politics that is playing out at local governments right now with, frankly, unsustainable, fragile coalitions that you can collapse any time. Having said that, the case that Ibrahim and I make is that, let me tell it in terms of a few tales bio, and then I'll wrap up. I went to Egypt, man, and I just made sure the computer is charged all the time because I expected the lights to go off at some point. But the lights didn't go off. There was no load shedding. And then I went to Ghana, and I said, no, maybe that was North Africa. Now we're entering sub-Saharan Africa. The power will go at some point. And the lights didn't go off. And then I went to Tanzania, and there's no load shedding. No, don't worry. I've been to the other giant. No, I know what's going on there. And Bio gave a lecture on that. I've been to Nigeria, and I want to make a confession. It took me 3 trips to Nigeria, and I stopped being an expert on Nigeria. It's complex. It's complex. That's all I'll say. But on a serious note, Tanzania recently had a surplus of energy that they wanted to sell to South Africa. Lesotho doesn't have load shedding. So this exceptionalism of the hegemon, let's get over it. Let me tackle 2 other questions. You asked one. If Mandela and Thabo Mbeki could articulate and actualize a real African agenda and do it, why can't it be done again? Right? It's the changes in government. Final point I want to make, your question. What is unique about the circumstances right now? The Constitution has been invoked a lot. The clarion call, the consensus that was there for the first half of the 15 years, a non-racial, non-sexist, united South Africa is no more. That's why you could have a colored party that's going to surprise people in the election. That South Africa, there's a sense of, and I'm going to be crude about it, there's a greater sense of tribal politics playing itself out now than there were 15 years ago, right? That President Zuma's government was more non-racial than the government of the president who wrote the Constitution. Fact, not reality. So, here are the unique circumstances that that got Ibrahim and I to make the case for a government of national unity. People don't give him credit. I mean, South Africans are good at stealing each other's ideas and just run with it. It's Achille Mbembe that first invoked the idea, as you know, Lebogang, about the hollowing out of the state. If Mandela was the nation builder, Thabo Mbeki was the state builder. There was a state that performed. And for all the criticism against Gia and everything, the economy grew at close to 7% by the time he left. Today it grows at 0.4%, right? Institutions were built. There was a professional civil service. There was an emphasis on a meritocratic state that could bring us to a developmental state. And as you know, Omano, a developmental state is not something you declare. It's a process. And I wish to end on this note, Bayo. I make a prediction for everybody here that the professionalization of the entire state, including DIRCO, will preoccupy or have to preoccupy the next government. That's how serious it is. The levels of poor service delivery, corruption, and I don't want to, I have my views about Zondo and the like, but the circumstances of the challenges we face are so unique that if you could have a grand coalition with all its risks and infighting and differences on Israel and whatever, the advantages of having such a government outweighs the risks of this, what's the beautiful word you used, infighting and the like. And that's what we are saying, that if the ANC, who helped to bring us to this point in the last 15 years, wants to come and rebuild South Africa alone after the 29th of February, they're going to struggle. Sorry, May. But let me give you a secret, but I will just claim I've never been to this meeting when anybody goes public with this information. There is a reason why one president who was recalled in 2008 for 10 years didn't attend an NEC meeting, and all of a sudden, voila, a few weeks before the 29th, he's back. And the crowds go, and Mbeki is back, and Motlanthe is back. There are people in the ANC that they couldn't be bothered what the outcome is going to be. But they've made it their duty to commit to go and rebuild this party. And I think the ANC must go through that process, whether they're victorious or not. I still think ANC, DA, EFF, what did you call them? Sprinters and stuff, Lebogang? Sprinkles, and so on. I say there's a better chance to build unity, cohesion, for the cohesion for the sake of social cohesion, unity in South Africa, rebuilding the state, and so on. And just finally, Ibrahim and I make the interesting point, because we were finishing the piece yesterday. We said, we're looking all the fanfare about signing the NHI. And we said, imagine if this NHI bill was actually negotiated in the context of a government of national unity. Then you won't have now litigation and people fighting over interests and stuff like that. That's what makes this period so unique. There is a socio-economic combustion, a bulge, a huge bulge that's waiting to explode in this country. South Africa doesn't have a problem with democracy. South Africa has a problem with socio-economic governance and delivery, and it underestimates the anger that is built up there in society. And a unified government is better than, with all the debates and differences. Even on Israel, they can reach consensus. I can tell you now, the DA will not leave BRICS. Yeah, they have a problem with Putin, but they will not leave BRICS. They can reach consensus on, and so on. And the Western powers might be more kind, sorry that I'm so blunt, might be more kind to see John Steenhuisen there than Julius Malema. So even if for such self-serving purposes, you were all very wonderful. Sorry that I came out of the closet in the end. But I think it's been a wonderful session. And Bayo, thank you for not asking me to be part of the panel. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. It's been a wonderful session. Have a great afternoon. Please drive safely. For those of you who prefer to drink and drive,